The road to the lake felt eternal, twisting through a dense forest that seemed to close in around them. Dr. Jennifer Holt sat in the front passenger seat, her fingers gripping her notebook tightly. The air in the Jeep was tense, the team silent as they processed the stories they'd heard in the nearby village. Shared dreams, strange disappearances, a lake that seemed to hum with its own life. Ethan Moore, the geologist driving the vehicle, broke the silence. "We're close," he said, his voice calm but strained. "Should be just over this ridge." Ryan Clark, the youngest of the group, leaned forward from the back seat. "The locals really didn't want us here," he said nervously. "Did you see the way they looked at us? They're just superstitious." Mark Davis, the team's anthropologist, replied with a dismissive wave. "Places like this always come with stories. We're here for facts, not folklore." Jennifer didn't respond. She was too focused on the unease that had been building in her chest since they entered the forest. The air felt heavier here, colder. She told herself it was just her imagination, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The Jeep finally emerged into a clearing, and the lake came into view. It was larger than Jennifer had imagined, its surface smooth and dark, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror. A faint mist hovered just above the water, curling in shapes that seemed almost purposeful. "Creepy," Lily Carter, the team's biologist, muttered as she climbed out of the Jeep. She stared at the lake, clutching her backpack tightly. "Why is it so still?" "Let's not get spooked before we even unpack," Jennifer said, forcing a smile. "We've got a lot of work to do." The team moved quickly, setting up their tents on the higher ground near the treeline. Ethan tested the soil near the shoreline, while Lily took water samples. Mark wandered the perimeter with his camera, muttering about capturing the atmosphere. Ryan set up monitoring equipment, though his hands shook slightly as he worked. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the group gathered around the campfire. The flickering light did little to dispel the growing unease. "So, what's the theory?" Mark asked, poking at the fire with a stick. "Shared dreams caused by what? Magnetic fields? Some kind of hallucinogenic algae. Could be geological," Ethan suggested. "If there's a fault line beneath the lake, it might be releasing gases that affect brain chemistry." "Or it's all in their heads," Lily said with a shrug. "People love a good ghost story." Jennifer didn't share her thoughts. She'd reviewed the reports before they arrived, and they all pointed to something beyond explanation. Travelers and locals described the same dreams. Visions of a crack in the earth that seemed to stretch into infinity, and the feeling of being pulled toward it. That night, the dreams began. Jennifer stood at the edge of the lake. The air was heavy, the mist swirling in unnatural patterns. She looked down and saw the water ripple, though there was no wind. Something was moving beneath the surface, a dark shape that grew larger as it rose toward her. Suddenly, the ground gave way, and she was falling. The water parted to reveal a massive crack in the earth, its edges jagged and uneven. It glowed faintly, a sickly green light pulsing from its depths. Jennifer felt it pulling at her, dragging her closer. She woke with a start, gasping for breath. The hum she'd heard in her dream was still there, faint but insistent, vibrating through the ground. She crawled out of her tent and froze. The lake was glowing. Jennifer stared at the lake, her breath catching in her throat. The glow was faint but unmistakable, a sickly green light pulsing just beneath the surface. The mist above the water swirled in slow, deliberate patterns, as though responding to the rhythm of the light. "Jennifer." Ryan's voice broke the silence, shaky and uncertain. She turned to see him standing outside his tent, his face pale in the moonlight. "What's happening?" "I don't know," Jennifer whispered. She stepped closer to the water's edge, the light reflecting in her wide eyes. The hum she'd heard earlier had grown louder, resonating deep in her chest. By now, the rest of the team had emerged, their faces filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. Ethan approached cautiously, his flashlight trained on the lake. "Is it some kind of bioluminescence?" he asked, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Bioluminescence doesn't hum," Lily replied, hugging herself against the cold. "And it doesn't feel like it's alive." Mark, ever the skeptic, raised his camera. "Whatever it is, we're documenting it," he said, snapping photos of the glowing water. This could be groundbreaking. Jennifer turned to the group. We don't know what we're dealing with here. Let's not jump to conclusions. Tomorrow, we'll analyze the water samples and run a deeper scan of the lake bed. Her words did little to ease the tension, but the team nodded reluctantly. One by one, they retreated to their tents, though Jennifer doubted any of them would sleep. She stayed up by the fire, her mind racing. Whatever was happening here, it was more than they had bargained for. The next morning, the glow was gone, and the lake looked as calm and lifeless as ever. But the hum remained, faint and ever-present. Ethan and Ryan set up the sonar equipment to map the lake bed, while Lily and Mark analyzed the water samples in the makeshift lab. Jennifer reviewed the sonar readings as they came in. The lake was deep, far deeper than expected for its size. But what caught her attention was the anomaly near the center. A massive crack in the lake bed, its edges jagged and uneven, stretching far deeper than the sonar could measure. It's not just a crack, Ethan said, leaning over her shoulder. It's a fault line, a big one. Jennifer frowned. How deep does it go? We can't tell, Ethan replied. The sonar loses signal past a certain point. It's like there's nothing down there. Jennifer's unease deepened. Could this be causing the hum? The glow? Maybe, Ethan said, though his tone was uncertain. But it doesn't explain the dreams. Jennifer's stomach tightened. She hadn't told the others about her dream, but now she wondered if she should. Before she could decide, Mark burst into the tent, his camera in hand. You need to see this, he said, his voice tense. Mark led them to the edge of the lake, where the morning mist had begun to lift. He replayed a video on his camera, the screen small but clear. The footage showed the lake at night, its surface glowing faintly. But then something moved. A shadowy figure, tall and thin, emerged from the water. It was only visible for a moment before dissolving back into the lake. What the hell is that? Lily asked, her voice trembling. A trick of the light, Ethan suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. Jennifer replayed the video, her hands trembling. The figure's movements were too deliberate to be dismissed. It had looked aware. We need to stay focused, she said finally, trying to steady her voice. Let's continue the scans. The more data we have, the better. But the video lingered in her mind, its implications too disturbing to ignore. That night, the dreams grew worse. Jennifer found herself standing at the edge of the crack, staring into its glowing depths. The hum was deafening now, vibrating through her bones. Shapes moved within the light, vague, shifting forms that seemed almost human. One of the shapes rose, its elongated limbs stretching toward her. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond. The figure leaned closer, its face smooth and featureless. It raised a hand and pointed into the crack. Come closer, it whispered, though the words echoed in her mind rather than her ears. It's time. Jennifer woke with a gasp, her body drenched in sweat. She stumbled out of her tent and nearly collided with Lily, who looked just as shaken. You had the dream too, Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jennifer nodded. We're all connected to it now. A sudden scream pierced the air, cutting through the stillness of the night. Jennifer and Lily spun around, their hearts racing. It was Ryan. They found him at the water's edge, staring down into the lake. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his face pale as though he'd seen something unspeakable. Ryan, Jennifer shouted, grabbing his arm. What's wrong? He turned to her slowly, his expression blank. It's opening, he said, his voice hollow. It's waking up. Before Jennifer could respond, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The hum grew louder, reverberating through the earth. The lake's surface rippled violently, and a faint green light began to shine from the center. The crack was widening. The ground shook beneath their feet as the hum grew deafening, reverberating through the forest like a living heartbeat. Jennifer tightened her grip on Ryan's arm, trying to pull him back from the lake, but he resisted, his gaze fixed on the water. It's opening, he repeated, his voice flat and mechanical, as if the words weren't his own. We have to go inside. Ryan, snap out of it, Jennifer shouted, shaking him. He blinked, his eyes clearing slightly, but the fear never left his face. Behind them, the rest of the team stumbled out of their tents, their faces pale with terror. Ethan was the first to speak. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice strained as the ground trembled beneath them. "The crack," Jennifer said, pointing toward the lake. "It's expanding." They turned their flashlights toward the water. The faint glow they'd seen the night before was now a vivid, pulsating green, spreading outward from the center of the lake. The mist above the water swirled violently, forming shapes that dissolved almost as quickly as they appeared. Mark aimed his camera at the lake, his hands trembling as he adjusted the lens. "We need to document this," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Whatever this is, it's not natural." "No kidding," Lily snapped, her voice trembling with barely contained panic. "This isn't just some geological phenomenon. That crack is alive." Jennifer turned to Ethan. "Can we get another reading on the depth?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Ethan shook his head, his expression grim. "The equipment's been glitching ever since the hum started. It's like the lake is interfering with the signals." Jennifer's stomach twisted. The lake wasn't just reacting to them. It was aware of them. As the sun rose, the shaking subsided, leaving the team exhausted and on edge. Jennifer gathered them around the campfire, their faces drawn and pale in the early morning light. "We need to figure out what's happening here," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "That crack, it's more than just a geological anomaly. It's changing." "Changing into what?" Lily asked, her voice tinged with fear. "I don't know," Jennifer admitted. "But we need answers." "Ethan, can you run another scan of the lake bed? We need to know how far this crack extends." Ethan hesitated, glancing nervously toward the water. "I'll try," he said finally, "but I can't promise the equipment will work." Jennifer nodded, then turned to Mark. "Keep recording. Document everything. If we can't stop this, we need evidence of what's happening." "And what about me?" Ryan asked, his voice shaky but determined. "You stay here," Jennifer said firmly. "You're not going near that lake." Ryan opened his mouth to protest, but one look at Jennifer's expression silenced him. He nodded reluctantly, his gaze dropping to the ground. The day passed in tense silence as the team worked. Ethan set up the sonar equipment near the water's edge, muttering under his breath as he adjusted the settings. Mark filmed everything, his hands trembling as he panned the camera across the lake. Lily analyzed the water samples, though her results made no sense. High concentrations of unknown minerals, readings that defied explanation. Jennifer pored over the data, her unease growing with every new anomaly. The crack wasn't just expanding, it was emitting energy. Low-frequency vibrations, electromagnetic pulses, even fluctuations in temperature. It was as if the crack itself was alive. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the hum returned, louder and more insistent than ever. The team gathered around the fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. "This isn't natural," Ethan said finally, breaking the silence. "This thing, whatever it is not just a crack in the earth. It's alive," Lily finished, her voice barely above a whisper. Jennifer nodded, her stomach churning. "It's aware of us," she said. "It's been watching us from the moment we arrived." "What does it want?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. Jennifer didn't answer. She didn't know. That night, the dreams returned, darker and more vivid than before. Jennifer stood at the edge of the crack, staring into its glowing depths. The light pulsed rhythmically like a heartbeat, and the hum was deafening. Shapes moved within the crack, vague and indistinct, but unmistakably alive. One of the shapes rose, its elongated limbs stretching toward her. Its face was smooth and featureless, but its presence was overwhelming, filling her with a sense of dread unlike anything she'd ever felt. "Come closer," it whispered, its voice resonating in her mind. "You belong to us." Jennifer tried to move, but her body was frozen. The figure reached for her, its hand closing around her wrist. Pain shot through her arm as the world dissolved into darkness. She woke with a scream, her heart pounding. The hum was louder now, vibrating through the air and the ground. She stumbled out of her tent and froze. The lake was glowing brighter than ever, its light illuminating the entire clearing. The mist above it had thickened, twisting into shapes that looked disturbingly human. The crack was widening. The team gathered near the water, their faces pale and terrified. Ryan stood closest to the lake, his gaze fixed on the glowing water. "It's calling us," he said, his voice hollow. "We have to go to it." "No," Jennifer said firmly, stepping between him and the lake. "No one is going anywhere near that crack." "You don't understand," Ryan said, his eyes glassy. "It won't let us leave." Before Jennifer could respond, the ground began to shake violently. The lake erupted, sending waves crashing against the shore. The green light flared brighter, and the hum grew deafening. Jennifer turned to the others, her voice barely audible over the roar. "Run!" But it was too late. The crack split wide open, its glowing depths consuming the lake bed. The team could only watch in horror as the water drained into the abyss, leaving behind a gaping chasm that seemed to stretch into infinity. From the crack emerged a figure, tall and thin, its limbs impossibly long and twisted. It stepped onto the dry lake bed, its featureless face turning toward them. "You have awakened us," it said, its voice a low, resonant vibration. "Now you will serve." The figure stood motionless on the dry lake bed, its elongated limbs silhouetted against the pulsating green light emanating from the crack. The air was thick, heavy, and charged with an energy that made every breath feel labored. The team huddled together near the treeline, their terror palpable. What is it?" Ryan whispered, his voice barely audible. Jennifer stepped forward, her instincts warring between fight and flight. "It's connected to the crack," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her chest. "It came from the same place. Then we seal it," Ethan said abruptly, clutching a crowbar he had grabbed from the campsite. "Whatever it is, we send it back where it came from." Jennifer turned to him, shaking her head. "We don't know what we're dealing with. If we act without understanding it, we could make things worse." "Worse than this?" Lily snapped, gesturing toward the lake bed. The crack stretched wider now, a gaping chasm that seemed to reach endlessly into the earth. More figures began to emerge, their forms vague and shifting, like shadows given substance. Jennifer's mind raced. The crack wasn't just a geological anomaly, it was a gateway, and it was opening. The ground trembled as the figures advanced. Their movements were slow but deliberate, their featureless faces tilting as though studying the terrified humans before them. One of the figures raised a hand, its long fingers curling in a beckoning gesture. Jennifer stepped back, her heart hammering in her chest. "We need to move," she said, her voice urgent. "Now!" The team turned and ran, the forest closing in around them as they fled. The hum followed them, vibrating through the air, the earth, their very bones. It was as if the crack's energy had spread, infecting everything it touched. They reached the campsite, but the sense of safety it once provided was gone. The hum was louder here, the vibrations shaking the ground beneath their feet. Jennifer grabbed her notebook and flipped through her notes, desperate for anything that might explain what was happening. "There's nothing here," she muttered, her voice trembling. "No data, no theories, just this presence." "What do we do?" Mark asked, his voice panicked. "We can't just sit here and wait for those things to catch up." Jennifer looked at him, her mind racing. "The crack, it's alive, but it's also contained," she said. "If we can stop it from opening further, maybe we can stop whatever's coming through." "And how do you suggest we do that?" Ethan demanded. "We don't have explosives. We don't even know what's keeping it open." Jennifer hesitated. She didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. The crack was feeding on them. Their thoughts, their fears, it was drawing them closer, using their energy to grow. Night fell quickly. The forest plunged into an oppressive darkness. The mist thickened, curling around the tents like grasping hands. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the air with an almost rhythmic cadence. Jennifer sat by the fire, staring into the flames as the weight of the situation pressed down on her. "You're thinking too hard," a voice said, breaking her reverie. She looked up to see Ryan sitting across from her, his expression distant. "It's not something you can solve. It's not a puzzle." Jennifer frowned. "What do you mean?" Ryan met her gaze, and for a moment, his eyes seemed too dark, too deep. "It doesn't want to be understood. It wants to be obeyed." Jennifer's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" He smiled faintly, the expression chillingly out of place. "I heard it in my dreams. It showed me the crack, the things inside it. They've been waiting for so long, Jennifer. And now they're awake." Jennifer's heart pounded. "Ryan, you're not making sense." "I understand now," he continued, his voice eerily calm. "It's not just a crack. It's a vein of the earth, and it's alive." Before Jennifer could respond, Ryan stood and walked toward the lake bed. The others noticed him and scrambled to stop him, but he moved too quickly, his steps steady and deliberate. "Ryan, stop!" Jennifer shouted, chasing after him. He reached the edge of the crack and turned back to face them. The green light bathed his face, casting long shadows across his features. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice reverent. "Don't you see? It's everything." And then he stepped into the abyss. The team froze, their screams of protest swallowed by the roar of the crack. Ryan's figure disappeared into the green glow, his body swallowed whole by the chasm. For a moment, the light flared brighter, and then it dimmed, the hum growing quieter. Jennifer fell to her knees, her body trembling. "He's gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not just gone," Ethan said, his voice hollow. "It took him." Jennifer looked at him, her mind reeling. The crack wasn't just a gateway. It was consuming them, drawing them in one by one. "We have to end this," she said, her voice filled with resolve. "Whatever's in that crack, whatever's feeding it, we have to stop it." As dawn broke, the team prepared for their descent. Ethan rigged the sonar equipment with makeshift explosives, using chemicals from Lily's lab. Mark carried his camera, determined to document whatever they found. Jennifer led the way, her mind focused on the task ahead. The lake bed was eerily silent as they approached the crack. The green light pulsed faintly, the hum barely audible now. The figures that had emerged the night before were gone, leaving only the yawning chasm. Jennifer stared into its depths, the light reflecting in her wide eyes. "This ends here," she said, more to herself than to the others. They descended into the crack, the ropes tied tightly around their waists. The air grew colder the deeper they went, the green light casting eerie shadows on the jagged walls. The hum grew louder, vibrating through their bodies. At the bottom, they found it, the heart of the crack, a massive, pulsating mass of green energy, its surface alive with shifting shapes and patterns. It was both beautiful and horrifying, a living embodiment of the crack's power. Ethan set the charges, his hands trembling. "We have to move fast," he said. "Once this goes off, we're out of time." Jennifer nodded, her gaze fixed on the mass. "Do it." Ethan activated the timer, and they began their ascent. The hum grew deafening now, the crack shaking violently as the energy within it reacted. The green light flared brighter, filling the entire chasm with blinding intensity. They reached the surface just as the explosion detonated. The ground heaved, and a deafening roar filled the air. The crack collapsed in on itself, the light snuffed out in an instant. And then silence. The team stood on the edge of the ruined lake bed, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The crack was gone, replaced by a gaping scar of blackened earth. The hum had disappeared, leaving behind an oppressive stillness. "It's over," Ethan said, his voice shaking. Jennifer nodded, though a sense of unease lingered. The crack was gone, but the forest around them felt wrong. Too quiet, too empty. As they packed their equipment and prepared to leave, Jennifer glanced back at the lake bed. For a brief moment, she thought she saw movement, a faint, shifting shadow deep within the earth. She shook her head, forcing the thought away. It was over. At least, that's what she told herself. The team returned to the campsite in a daze, their bodies exhausted and their minds barely holding together. The scar left by the explosion was still visible in the distance, a jagged black wound cutting through the earth where the lake had once been. The hum was gone, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. Jennifer collapsed by the fire pit, staring blankly at the cold ashes. Her hands still trembled, her ears ringing from the force of the explosion. She had thought the crack's destruction would bring relief, but all she felt was emptiness. "Is it really over?" Lily asked, breaking the silence. She was sitting on the ground, clutching her knees to her chest. Her voice wavered with uncertainty. "It has to be," Ethan said, though his tone lacked conviction. He paced near the tree-line, his eyes darting nervously toward the ruined lake bed. "We destroyed the source. There's nothing left." Jennifer remained silent. She wanted to believe him, but something deep inside her refused to settle. The crack had been alive, aware, and ancient. It had existed long before they arrived, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly gone. "Mark?" Jennifer asked, turning toward him. He was hunched over his camera, scrolling through the footage he had taken in the crack. "What did you see down there?" Mark didn't answer immediately. His face was pale, and his hands shook as he held the camera. "It wasn't just energy," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was something else. Shapes. Figures. They were moving inside it." Jennifer's stomach tightened. "Figures?" Mark nodded. "I don't think the crack was just a gateway. It was alive, and whatever was inside it, it wasn't meant to be destroyed." The weight of his words hung heavily over the group. Lily shook her head vehemently. "No, we stopped it. It's over. It has to be." But Jennifer couldn't shake the growing unease in her chest. The forest felt different now. Too quiet, too still. She glanced toward the scarred earth where the lake had been, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw something shift in the distance. A faint ripple of movement, too subtle to be natural. That night, Jennifer couldn't sleep. She lay in her tent, staring at the fabric above her, her mind racing. The silence of the forest was oppressive, pressing down on her like a weight. She wanted to believe they had won, but every fiber of her being told her otherwise. She sat up abruptly, her chest tightening. She needed air. Stepping outside, she was struck by how still everything was. The mist had returned, thicker than ever, curling around the campsite like smoke. "Can't sleep?" Ethan's voice startled her. He was sitting by the fire pit, poking at the cold embers with a stick. Jennifer shook her head and sat down beside him. "It doesn't feel right," she admitted. "The silence, the stillness. It's like the forest is holding its breath." Ethan nodded slowly. "I feel it too. Like we didn't end it. Like we just made it angry." Jennifer's chest tightened at his words. She wanted to dismiss them, to cling to the hope that the worst was behind them. But deep down, she knew he was right. As dawn broke, the group prepared to leave. The forest seemed to close in around them as they packed their equipment, the towering trees casting long shadows that seemed almost alive. Mark's camera buzzed faintly as he checked the last of his footage. "What is it?" Lily asked, noticing the look on his face. Mark frowned, adjusting the playback. "There's something here." At the end of the footage, after the explosion, Jennifer and Ethan crowded around him, watching as the screen flickered. The footage showed the crack collapsing, the green light flaring one last time before snuffing out. But as the dust settled, the camera captured something else, something impossible. A figure, tall and shadowy, stood at the edge of the crack. It didn't move, but its presence was unmistakable. The screen froze on the figure, its smooth, featureless face staring directly at the camera. "It's still here," Jennifer whispered, her voice barely audible. The journey back to the village was harrowing. The silence of the forest seemed to follow them, pressing in on all sides. Even the wildlife, once so vibrant, was absent now. The team spoke little, each of them lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the village, the locals were waiting for them. Their faces were grim, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and pity. One of the elders stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Jennifer. "You saw it," he said, his voice low and heavy. It wasn't a question. Jennifer nodded, her throat tightening. "What is it?" she asked. "What's in that crack?" The elder sighed, his expression somber. "It is the Earth's memory," he said. A wound that never heals. You may have closed it, but it will open again. It always does. The words hit her like a blow. What do you mean? We destroyed it. The elder shook his head. You cannot destroy what is eternal. The crack is not just a place, it is a force. It feeds and it grows. You delayed it, nothing more. Jennifer's stomach churned. She wanted to argue, to demand answers, but she knew it was futile. The crack had existed long before them, and it would exist long after. That night, back in the village, Jennifer dreamed of the lake. She stood at its edge, staring into the water. The green light had returned, pulsing faintly from the depths. She saw the crack again, wider now, stretching endlessly into the earth. From within the crack came the figures, their forms shifting and twisting like shadows given life. They surrounded her, their featureless faces turning toward her. You cannot escape, they whispered, their voices resonating in her mind. You are part of us now. Jennifer woke with a start, her body drenched in sweat. She looked around the small room she had been given, her heart racing. The hum was back, faint but unmistakable, vibrating through the walls. She knew then that the crack wasn't gone. It was waiting, and it wouldn't wait for long. Jennifer sat on the edge of the creaking bed in the small village room, her head in her hands. The faint hum that had returned during the night still vibrated faintly in her skull, a ghostly reminder of what they had tried to leave behind. The others were quiet, each grappling with their own horrors. No one had spoken of the figure captured in Mark's footage or the elder's warning. Yet, the silence between them screamed louder than words ever could. We need to leave, Ethan said finally, breaking the stillness. His voice was hoarse, his exhaustion evident. Not just the village, this entire area. We need to get as far away as possible. It won't matter, Mark said, staring blankly at the floor. His camera sat untouched on the table beside him. It'll follow us. It's not a place. It's inside us now. Jennifer turned to him sharply. What do you mean? Mark looked up, his eyes dark and haunted. The dreams, the hum, the figure. Don't you feel it? We brought it back with us. Wherever we go, it'll find us. Jennifer's stomach churned. She wanted to deny it, to insist that they could outrun whatever was happening. But deep down, she knew he was right. The crack hadn't just affected the lake. It had reached into them, leaving its mark in ways they were only beginning to understand. As the sun rose, they prepared to leave the village. The locals watched them silently, their expressions a mixture of pity and dread. Jennifer approached the elder who had spoken to her the night before. Is there a way to stop it? She asked, her voice trembling. The elder studied her for a long moment, his weathered face impassive. It cannot be stopped, he said finally. Only delayed. And even that comes at a cost. Jennifer's heart sank. What kind of cost? The elder didn't answer. Instead, he handed her a small, intricately carved stone. Symbols covered its surface, the same ones they had seen on the walls of the crack. You will know when the time comes, he said cryptically. Jennifer wanted to press him for more information, but Ethan called out to her from the jeep, urging her to hurry. She slipped the stone into her pocket and joined the others, her mind racing with unanswered questions. The drive back through the forest was eerily quiet. The hum had faded again, but its absence was almost worse. It felt like the calm before a storm. As they neared the outskirts of the forest, Lily suddenly gasped, pointing toward the treeline. Stop the car, she shouted. Ethan slammed on the brakes, and they all stared in stunned silence. Standing among the trees, half shrouded in mist, was the figure from the lake. Its elongated limbs were motionless, its featureless face turned directly toward them. It's watching us, Ryan whispered, his voice trembling. Jennifer felt a cold dread settle over her. She reached for the carved stone in her pocket, her fingers tracing the symbols as she tried to steady herself. Drive, she said quietly. Don't stop, no matter what. Ethan hesitated, but the look in her eyes convinced him. He pressed the accelerator, and the jeep lurched forward. The figure remained still as they passed, its head tilting slightly as if in acknowledgement. They reached the highway by nightfall, but the tension in the air remained heavy. Jennifer sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the landscape blurred past. The hum had returned, faint but unmistakable, vibrating in her bones. "It's not over," Mark said from the back seat, his voice barely audible. "It'll never be over." Jennifer turned to him, her frustration boiling over. "What are you saying? That we just give up? Let it take us?" Mark met her gaze, his expression resigned. "It's not about what we let it do. It's about what it's already done. We were never going to escape this." Jennifer opened her mouth to argue, but a sharp, sudden pain in her chest stopped her. She gasped, clutching her ribs as the hum grew louder, drowning out the sound of the engine. The others reacted too, their faces contorted in pain as the vibrations seemed to consume the air around them. The Jeep skidded to a stop on the side of the road, and they stumbled out, clutching their heads as the hum reached a deafening crescendo. Jennifer fell to her knees, the carved stone slipping from her pocket and landing in the dirt. The hum stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Jennifer looked up, her vision blurry. The figure was there, standing in the middle of the road, its elongated limbs reaching toward them. Behind it, the mist thickened, swirling into a shape that resembled the crack. The green light began to glow faintly, pulsating like a heartbeat. "No," Jennifer whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't real." "It's as real as we are," the figure said, though its smooth face didn't move. Its voice was low and resonant, vibrating through the air. "You opened the way. Now you belong to us." Jennifer grabbed the stone, clutching it tightly as she stood. The symbols on its surface began to glow faintly, and the figure paused, its head tilting as though curious. "What is this?" she demanded, holding the stone out in front of her. "What does it do?" The figure took a step closer, its movements slow and deliberate. "It is a gift," it said. "A key. But every key has its price." Jennifer's grip tightened on the stone. She didn't understand its purpose, but she felt its power. "What happens if I use it?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward her. "Decide," it said simply. Jennifer's mind raced. She could feel the stone pulsing in her hand, its energy building with every passing second. She didn't know what it would do, but she knew one thing. It was their only chance. She closed her eyes and pressed the stone to her chest. The world erupted in light. Jennifer felt the energy surge through her, filling her with a blinding, all-consuming heat. The hum returned, louder than ever, but now it felt different, controlled, focused. She opened her eyes and saw the figure step back, its form flickering like a dying flame. The crack in the mist began to collapse, the green light fading as the figures retreated into the void. The hum grew quieter, then stopped altogether, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. Jennifer fell to the ground, the stone slipping from her grasp. It crumbled into ash, carried away by the wind. The others rushed to her side, their faces filled with a mixture of relief and fear. "What happened?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. "Is it over?" Jennifer stared at the empty road, her body trembling. "I don't know," she said finally. "But I think we stopped it." They returned to the village the next day, their bodies and minds battered but alive. The locals greeted them with quiet solemnity, their expressions unreadable. The elder approached Jennifer, his gaze lingering on her for a long moment. "You delayed it," he said finally, "but it will return." Jennifer nodded, the weight of his words settling over her. She didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. As they left the village, Jennifer glanced back at the forest one last time. The mist had lifted, and the hum was gone, but she knew the crack wasn't truly sealed. It was only waiting. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and I'd love to hear your comments.